Right, should we start things off, Michelle? Yeah, great.
Yep.
Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining on this very hot day, I guess. So maybe joining some training is one of the less taxing things you could be doing. So thanks a lot for joining. It's clearly a small group, so do feel free. I think the way we can have it is do feel free to ask any questions as we go along. Um, so I'll just do the introduction. So I'm Louis McWilliam. I'm head of immigration at Truth Legal Solicitors. I am joined here by Michelle. I shall let Michelle introduce herself.
Hello. Yes, thank you for joining. My name's Michelle. I'm an immigration solicitor in Louis' team.
And we've also got Katie, who's assisting. Um, so yeah, today we're looking at, if we go to the next slide, we're looking at everything you need to know if you're considering sponsoring a care worker. So we've kind of focused on the care worker side here. However, it really applies to nurses as well. So if you're kind of interested in sponsoring any kind of health care worker, then this should be useful for you. Um, just brief a little bit about Truth Legal. So we started hmm, about 2014, I think, and we've had the immigration department now for a couple of years, and really for the last year or so, we've been focusing a lot of our work in the care sector. So we've been quite well talking a bit about how we've been active in the care sector, some of the kind of lobbying work we've done, and we've got a lot of information um, on our website to help people, to help care providers interested in sponsorship. Myra has just said she needs to go at 20 past 10. We are actually recording this whole session, okay? So it'll be available, I guess, on our website um, soon. So yeah, no thanks, Myra. But you should be able to catch up what you miss out on. All right, so yeah, we'll dive into the next slide and what we're going to look at today. So this is for care providers who are thinking about going down the sponsor license route. You may already have a sponsor license, but you may not have a sponsor license. So you may need to get one. So this is really a sort of high level overview of what you need to be thinking about before you go down this road. Okay, there are significant pros and cons, and so what the purpose of today is not to pretend that sponsorship is this very easy option for you, which will solve all your problems. It does have drawbacks, and there are things you need to go in with your eyes open. So we'll be looking at the kind of pros and cons of sponsorship, and then we'll have a bit more of a look at the process and the timeline for sponsorship. So unfortunately, the government don't make sponsorship, the process and what you're meant to do, easy. Okay, there's information, but it's kind of not very coherent. So we'll just really break down what are the different steps you'll need to go through, how long it's all going to take. We'll look at some of the key issues that you need to be aware of. So stuff like sponsor license compliance, um, stuff like how the visa process works for the individual. And then we'll look at this issue of, well, do you need a lawyer? So our approach at Truth Legal, believe it or not, is to give away the information for free. So if you go on our website, you can see detailed guides on how to do this all yourself. But we'll also try and have a kind of honest assessment of what we can add to the process if you wish. Okay, and so yeah, if you've got any questions, please do fire away as we go along, because it's a small group, we can just deal with stuff as we go. But otherwise, I will crack on to the next slide, please. I think this is over to you, Michelle, isn't it?
Yes, this is me. So I'm going to start with a bit of background on why sponsorship has become so popular recently. A lot of employers, particularly in sectors like care, are starting to think about sponsoring from overseas. A lot of to do with that is the staff shortages in the sector, which if you are a care provider, you will know all about. We've kind of deemed those sort of negative factors. So the end of free movement, the B word, Brexit has kind of, turned off a tap on some labour that we used to get from Europe, Europeans potentially going back to their countries of origin, and we just don't have access. We don't have as easy access to that sort of labour as we used to, because Europeans now need to be sponsored under this system, the same as any other overseas worker. Whereas, of course, before it was sufficient for them to show their European or EU passport at the border, and then they could come here and work without the need for a sponsoring employer. So that's one of the negative factors. The other one, a shortage of homegrown talent. So all sorts of things feed into that, specifically in care. So pandemic, obviously very hard for care workers who were sort of on the front line of this country's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And, that made a hard job even harder, I suppose, for a good couple of years. Some question over whether mandatory vaccines has had an impact on people leaving the profession. Just generally a big shortage there, as I'm sure you're experiencing if you're involved in care. Positive factors, so a bit more cheerful. There have been some improvements to the old sponsorship system. It used to be called Tier 2. You sometimes still hear it referred to as Tier 2, but technically these days it's no longer called Tier 2, and it is called the skilled worker sponsorship route. So the government did try to loosen this a little bit. So there's the lowering of the skill level to RQF3, used to be RQF6, which was significantly higher. This means that it's kind of any jobs that are at sort of A level or above, although there's no requirement for your workers actually to have a British A level. But the important thing is it includes normal care roles. So to start with, it was just senior care workers that were eligible for sponsorship, as well as nurses and some other senior healthcare professionals. This year in February 2022, they did, relax that to include standard non-senior care workers as well, which we think, if anything, was a bit too late to relieve the staff pressures in the care sector, but there we go. So that was the lowering of the skill level, definitely helpful to employers. Also, the abolition of the resident labour market test. So if you ever come across this, be reassured that it no longer applies. The resident labour market test used to be quite an onerous, headachy sort of procedure for advertising your role within the UK. You had to jump through various hoops to show that you really couldn't recruit from the UK before you were able to sponsor from overseas. That has been abolished, so it's no longer quite so prescriptive. You do still have to show a genuine vacancy, which we come on to talk about in a little bit. And then the final point we've got under there is adding care workers to the shortage occupation list. So as I said, prior to February 2022, senior care workers were on there. I think it was the 15th of February that care workers were also added, after quite a lot of pressure on the government to make that happen. And there are various benefits to employers for care workers being on the shortage occupation list, not least of those that you can pay a lower minimum salary rate. Again, we'll come on to talk about things like minimum salary later. And then the final point we've got on this slide is the introduction of the health and care worker visa. So this is a fairly attractive visa option. It's a special type of skilled worker visa. So most workers coming here to work will need to get a skilled worker visa. Healthcare workers are generally eligible for this health and care worker visa, and the benefits are significantly lower costs and generally faster processing times as well. Great, next slide, please. So next is some pros and cons. Pros of sponsorship. So in terms of loyalty, the sponsored worker has to work for you. So when they are sponsored, their work visa is really tied to you as the sponsoring employer. Their whole right to be in the UK is contingent on their role as your employee. The only way they can sort of jump ship and go work for someone else is if they find another sponsoring employer who has a sponsor license and is willing to take them on in that way. So that means your sponsored workers have a much smaller pool of competing employers that can poach them, whereas obviously a British or settled worker can can jump ship anytime and go and work for anyone. That's not true for your sponsored workers. They are tied to you in that way. Question mark next to the next one. Do you get a higher caliber of worker? The reason we include this is because sometimes we see care workers, senior care workers, nurses from overseas who are very, very highly qualified in their own countries, and they want to come here because of, you know, lifestyle advantages to living in the UK. So some suggestion that you might get, you know, some better quality candidates, although I don't want to say anything too controversial there. Ability to bring dependents. So yeah, so your skilled worker, your health and care worker can bring their family, generally spouses, partners, children. And the weird thing is that the dependents are actually not limited in terms of what they can do in the UK. So I've said that your sponsored worker, your care worker or your nurse, they are tied to you as the employer, but their husband, wife, daughter, son can do, you know, can study here, can work here for whoever they like, can choose not to work if they prefer. So that's pretty attractive to families from overseas. And the last one, which I touched on the last slide, is reduced visa fees under the health and care worker visa. I've got the precise figures coming up a bit later, but it's kind of better than half of what you'd pay for a standard skilled worker visa. So again, that makes coming to the UK to work in the care sector an attractive option for people from overseas. Next slide, please. And then we've got some cons. So costs, there's a whole slide coming up about costs. But yeah, I mean, it is a big con, sorry, to sponsorship. You do have to invest some money in this. There's a license fee, there's various fees along the way. And you know, it's best for you to go into that with your eyes open. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. There's also a time investment to consider. Firstly, to prepare the license application itself. So Louis said earlier, the process of getting a sponsor license is not exactly straightforward in some ways. There's a lot of evidence that you have to gather. We generally recommend writing a cover letter to include with your application. You can get a lawyer to do that for you. You can do it yourself. We'll talk about why you might want a lawyer in a bit. And there's an online application to fill in. So yeah, it's just a bit of a time investment there to actually get the license, and also to make sure you're doing it properly, because if you get it wrong, you're going to incur more time, more costs to get it right. And then the second point under time is there's an ongoing requirement to comply with your sponsor duties. Again, we'll talk about this in a little while, but it's mainly sort of compliance duties, monitoring your sponsored workers, that sort of thing. There's also the slightly scary risk of sanctions if you're found to be not compliant. So Home Office can come and inspect you at any time. And if you're falling short of any of these requirements, there are, you know, some sanctions they can impose, which can be pretty disruptive to your business. I think it's back to Louis now for the next one. No, it's not. I tell a lie. This is me. Right, I've got one more to go. Apologies. Yeah, so costs of sponsor licenses, as promised, here are the numbers. So I'll talk you through them briefly. These are all for if you're a small business. If you are a large business, then the higher costs apply. But for small businesses, the application fee itself is £536, which you pay once, and that gets you a license for 4 years. You'll then have to pay that after 4 years to renew if you want to. Each certificate of sponsorship is £199, and you need one of those per worker. So if you're going to be sponsoring on a large scale, that can add up. The scary one is the Immigration Skills Charge, or ISC, which is £364 per worker per year. Now, although I'm saying it's a yearly fee, you don't pay it yearly. You pay it all up front when you assign the certificate of sponsorship to the individual. So that means if you're sponsoring a worker for, well, you know, 3 years, you're going to pay 3 times 364. You can actually sponsor for anything up to 5 years, in which case you're going to pay 5 times 364, which does add up. A lot of employers bring that duration of sponsorship down just to kind of control the fees a little bit. I mean, if you do want to sponsor someone for 5 years, you're going to end up paying 5 times 364. But if you kind of chunk the periods of sponsorship out, you can lower that cost. You know, or spread the cost at least. So those are the fees that kind of fall to the employer by default, and then there's a couple at the bottom here which generally fall to the worker by default. So we've got the visa fee, and these are the reduced figures that are applicable in the healthcare sector. to workers eligible for that health and care worker visa. And that does include care workers, senior care workers, nurses, support workers, that kind of thing. So 247 is for a visa lasting for up to 3 years. 479 is for a visa lasting for 3 years or longer. And that's the same whether your worker is in the country or overseas when they apply for their visa. That is a significant saving on the normal skilled worker visa, which is sort of 600 or 700 for up to 3 years, and then 12 or 1400 for 3 years or longer. So it's a significant saving there. And the other big saving is that eligible applicants for the health and care worker visa are exempt from the immigration health surcharge, or IHS. So ordinarily that's another one of those scary per year ones, and it's actually 624 per year. So if you were sponsoring someone for up to 5 years, they would be liable to pay 5 times 624 all in one go. But quite rightly, applicants for the health and care worker visa are exempt from the IHS on the basis that, you know, many of them are coming to work in our health sector. So it was sort of deemed a bit illogical that they should be then paying to use the same healthcare that they're coming here to help provide. So those are the fees. I don't know what you think of those. Got some sort of thought points on the bottom, like, is that less than you thought, more than you thought? And the other point I often hear from employers as well, you should see my Indeed bill. I'm already spending quite a lot on recruitment and it's not even working for me. So perhaps it's worth kind of biting the bullet and throwing some money at this, because you know, you might get better results than you do through Indeed. Yeah, that's just some insight from us. Okay, now I'm pretty sure I'm handing over to Louis. I am.
Thanks. Okay, so yeah, I thought just next bit we'll just go through the process. Okay, so you know what happens. You think you want to go down the sponsorship route. There are various stages that you have to go through, and this slide's really a sort of high-level overview of what you have to do from taking that decision to sponsor through to that individual, that care worker, that nurse actually getting the visa in their hand, coming to the UK and starting to work for you in their sponsored role. So the first step is to get your license. Now, as Michelle said, that's a one-off process. So you just need one license, and then you can sponsor, in theory, as many people as you want. That license is valid for 4 years. Renewing it's a formality. So there's some legwork to get the license, but then once you've got it, yes, you renew after 4 years, but it's a formality. I'm going to come through I'm going to go through the timings next, but now it's just the sort of sequence of steps you'll need to take. So you've got your license. Now you're ready to make a move and sponsor someone. Now, each individual that you sponsor will need something called a certificate of sponsorship. There's 2 types of certificate of sponsorship, depending on whether the individual you want to sponsor is inside the UK or if they're outside of the UK. So if they're inside of the UK, it's called an undefined certificate. And if they're outside the UK, it's a defined certificate. Just on that note, top tip that we're often saying to employers, and employers are also feeding back to us, that if you can sponsor a student, especially one who's already working for you, then they are exempt from you having to pay the skills charge or levy. Okay, so top tip, get the students if you can. So we'll quite often get a student who's doing a bit of part-time work for you, maybe. They're doing a degree and it could be something relevant, might not be. But if they're happy to switch, you've got a feel for them working for you. They know the UK, they're not coming over. It's not a big quite leap that it is with others. So they're often a good bet. Anyway, one way or another, you've applied for your certificate of sponsorship. You then get allocated a certificate. Now, a certificate's not a physical thing, it's just a digital thing that's added to your license, saying that you now have a license, have a certificate. So when you get your license, you get this web interface where you can manage your license and do whatever needs to be done. And so once you get your certificate, You then have to assign it to the individual, so to Joe Bloggs over in Philippines or India or wherever, who's going to be your care worker. So assigning it means linking it, so you're inputting their details. And then once that's assigned, that individual can apply for his or her visa in the country they reside in. So they'll be applying for a skilled worker visa. So the individual then gets their visa and enters the UK and starts work. So if we just go to the next slide, I'll just go through the timing of this in case you're thinking, well, how long does this work in practice? So I said that the first step is to apply for your skilled worker sponsor license. So from when it's an online application. From when you submit it online, you then have a couple of days to email everything to the Home Office. That is 8 weeks. Okay, so at the moment, there's a massive demand for sponsor licenses. 8 weeks is really the maximum the Home Office say they'll take, but unfortunately it is taking the full 8 weeks. Now, in theory, you can pay for something called priority processing, which is an additional £500 on top of everything else, which brings it down to 3 weeks. But in practice, there's only 10 slots available a day. It's an absolute nightmare. So in practice, it's very hard to get hold of. So I would say just accept it's going to be 8 weeks to get your license. Okay. So you've got your license. You now want to sponsor someone. You need to apply for a certificate of sponsorship. Okay. So the first time you apply for that so the first time it's actually taken quite a long time. It can be 6 weeks for your first request, but then after that, it's just a few days. So it's fairly, first time they're a bit suspicious. They being the Home Office, may be a bit suspicious about what you're doing. They'll ask for more information. You reply, so that slows down the first request. But after that, it should be fairly instant getting your certificate. So you've now got your certificate, you now need to assign it, so you need to link it to the individual. That should take well, it does take instant effect, so that happens straight away. So once the certificate is assigned to Joe Bloggs, the individual, the future care worker, he can apply for his skilled worker visa. So that's an online application that needs to be submitted. That normally takes 3 weeks to actually get his or her visa. Okay. Ordinarily, you can pay, well, I say you, I mean the individual can pay an extra 250 odd pounds and get priority processing on that visa application, which would bring it down to more like a week. Okay, so normally it's 3 weeks. Chuck a bit more money at them. So one thing you learn with the Home Office is you just crudely give them more money and things happen more quickly. Okay. But so it's normally 3 weeks, but can be a week if you pay more money. However, unfortunately, due to the Ukraine situation, there's quite significant delays on the visa application bit. So it's more like, 6 to 8 weeks we're hearing. Seems to be really quite slow at the moment. Yeah. So this is and then so like normally 3 weeks for the individual to get their visa, they can then come to the UK and commence employment. Okay, so if you don't have a license, you're probably looking at, I've got it there, 2 to 4 months from applying for a license to someone starting work at your business. I mean, it's 4 months really, unless you start purchasing those priority services. Hopefully that's good. Can I just ask a question? Just does anyone who's attending, do any of you have a license yet? If you could let me know in the chat box, that'd be great. And in the meantime, we can move on to the next slide, please.
This is me.
It's over to you, Michelle.
It is, yes. So this slide just contains some key issues to be aware of when you're applying for a sponsor license, sponsoring workers, just all in one place really. So First thing we often talk to clients about is key personnel. Now, the key issue with these is they are subject to some criminal background checks. You need to have a clean immigration history, financial soundness. So when I talk about key personnel, these are people in your organisation who are going to manage the licence. You normally have an authorising officer, a level 1 user, and a key contact. So you have to appoint those when you apply for the licence. They have various roles to do with managing the licence, and as I say, they need to be able to pass those checks in terms of criminal record, immigration history, that kind of thing. Second point here is duration of sponsorship. So I actually touched on this a little bit earlier. There is an article on our website all about this particular issue, actually, if you're interested. But we're commonly advising clients who are saying, yes, we want to sponsor them for up to 5 years. That's the maximum you can do. But of course, when you go for the full 5 years, you end up paying more upfront in terms of those yearly fees that you pay up front. So commonly seeing employers sponsor for 2 or 3 years. I would say that's pretty much the most common option that people choose, and then renew everything after that. The only disadvantage is if you're going for like 2 or 3 years, at the end of that period, you need to apply for a new certificate of sponsorship, which can take a little bit of time, and also the individual has to apply to extend their visa. So there's a little bit more kind of administrative hassle involved in that, but you might decide it's worth it because of the ability to spread those costs over the 5 years. Third point, you've got no obligation to retain workers. So quite often employers will come to us and say, well, what if it's not working out after 6 months or 3 months or, longer? Am I stuck with this person if I've picked to sponsor them for 3 years? So you're not stuck with them. You can actually kind of, no obligation to retain them other than in accordance with normal UK employment law. So you can terminate their contract in the same way as you would anyone else. There is one, if you terminate a sponsored employer, if their employment with you ceases for any reason, you do have to notify the Home Office, but that's really the only additional burden on you, and you do that through the online portal that Louis was talking about. So it's not particularly onerous. Job adverts. So earlier I talked about the resident labour market test, which has been abolished, thankfully. I did say that the only thing that remains of the resident labour market test is this requirement to show a genuine vacancy. Now, the best way to show a genuine vacancy, in our opinion, is to provide with your licence application some evidence of advertising, unsuccessful advertising. Now, if you're anything like some of the employers we speak to, you'll be saying, yes, I've done loads of unsuccessful advertising and it's just not working. So what we normally recommend as evidence with the license application is a sort of screenshot of something from Indeed posted for a minimum of kind of 2 or 3 weeks. Sorry, we've got a question. We'll come back to that in a second. And normally like a Word document or a spreadsheet listing your applicants that you have had and why they weren't suitable for the role. So that's something else to be aware of. Generally doesn't tend to slow people down too much though. And indeed, any advertising evidence you've got already might do the job without having to re-advertise. Minimum salary is quite a big issue. So you'll probably be aware that there are certain salary thresholds that you need to meet or exceed in order to sponsor workers from overseas. Now, for care workers and senior care workers, because they're on the shortage occupation list, the salary is lower. It's 20,480 per year. That's gross. For other sponsored workers, it's 25,600. So there's a bit of a saving to you there, thanks to the shortage occupation list. I should say that has to be a sort of basic rate. They don't take account of any allowances or overtime or bonuses or accommodation or transport or anything like that. It is just basic salary. There's also this requirement to pay a minimum of £10.10 per hour. So, I mean, these things get a bit tricky if you've got sort of strange working hours. You have to kind of pro-rata things up and down. But those are kind of the headlines: 20,480 a year and a minimum of £10.10 per hour. Nurses are a little bit more complicated. So if I have the next slide, please. So nurses are paid in accordance with the NHS band system, which is copied for you here, although perhaps you know more about this than I do. So instead of for that 20,480, it's dependent on whatever band your nurse will be working in. I did one recently where the nurses fell under band 5, so I assume that's kind of logical. You should also remember that there is I think you get an 8-month kind of grace period where the nurses are sort of deemed to be pre-registration nurses. So there's part of their registration process, even if they're well qualified overseas, excuse me, they still have to come here, and there's part of the NMC registration that has to be completed in the UK. I think it's an exam or similar. Anyway, their visa gives them a sort of 8-month grace period during which to complete that registration in the UK. And I believe they can be paid slightly less during that period. And there's also scope for them to work for you in some capacity. So although they're technically pre-registration during those 8 months, they can do some work for you, but not as a fully fledged UK qualified nurse just yet. Right, that's actually all I want to say on nurses. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about compliance. If I could have the next slide. So I touched on this a little bit earlier. Now the Home Office sees having a sponsor license as a privilege, not a right. So what's on the slide here is quoted directly from Home Office guidance. So this kind of gives you a flavour of what they're thinking in terms of policy for sponsoring workers. Sponsorship is a privilege, not a right. Those who benefit most directly from employing migrant workers must play their part in ensuring the immigration system is not abused. So the Home Office is kind of paranoid, basically, that people are coming here, ostensibly to work and then not doing as they should. So the Home Office kind of sees you as the holder of a sponsor license as a way to kind of outsource some of these responsibilities for monitoring sponsored workers. And you kind of have to do your part to ensure that the UK immigration system isn't abused. There's a little bit more there, but I'll go to the next highlighted bit. So when a sponsor is granted a license, significant trust is placed in them. With this trust comes a direct responsibility to act in accordance with the UK's immigration laws, all parts of this sponsor guidance, and with wider UK law. Now, there are reams and reams of sponsor guidance. Not all of it is user-friendly or particularly accessible, but the obligation on you is to ensure that you're following all of it in terms of your sponsorship of workers. So I think that's all I have to say on that, but if you could take me to the next slide, please. Yeah, so there's inspections, sanctions, etc. Just before I talk about that, I will say a bit about what these duties are that you have to comply with. So there's various things in terms of record keeping. You need to be monitoring visa expiry dates. You need to be keeping up-to-date contact details of your sponsored workers, and archiving historical contact details as well. Again, because the Home Office is paranoid that so-and-so from India will come here, saying they're going to work for you, and then as soon as they get here, they sort of abscond and disappear. So it's just on you to kind of make sure we've got up-to-date contact details if that were to happen. You need to be monitoring their absences, so they're allowed sickness, they're allowed holidays in the same way that any British or settled worker is allowed, but again, the Home Office wants to see that they are coming here and working as per the terms of their visa and not having more holiday than they should be entitled to, that kind of thing. So you just need to have records of absences. There's various reporting requirements. So if your sponsored worker doesn't show up to work for, I think, 10 days in a row without good explanation, then you have to report that using the online web management system. You have to report changes to the sponsored worker's role, so if they get a promotion or a salary increase, that kind of thing. So, I mean, none of it is sort of rocket science. It's all quite straightforward. And to be honest, the vast majority of employers that I speak to are already doing most of these things. It's just about kind of tidying up and making sure that there's no gaps in that. The other thing that becomes really important when you become a sponsor are right to work checks. So you should be doing right to work checks in respect of all your workers, even the Brits. But as the holder of a sponsor license, you just become a bit more subject to scrutiny, and you need to make sure that all those things are kind of happening as they should be. So that's things like seeing a copy of the worker's right to work here, whether that's a passport or a visa or a BRP, and keeping a copy of it. For certain workers these days, it can all be done online. Other workers, you have to do it more manually in the old-fashioned way. Okay, so that's kind of a bit about, you know, what you actually have to do. Inspections. So the Home Office likes to call these visits, but that's a bit cuddly, to be honest. It's much safer to think of it as an inspection or an audit. You can be inspected before or after your license is granted. So really, you can be inspected from the moment that you hit submit on your license application. So you should be ready to prove that you can comply with all those duties that I talked about from a pretty early stage. You know, the time to think about it is when you're applying, not when you're starting to sponsor workers. We're actually commonly seeing a sort of pre-license mini inspection by letter at the moment. This sort of started the turn of the year, really. So January 2022, suddenly our clients were all getting these quite scary looking letters from the Home Office having applied for their sponsor license. And the letter just asks you, can you show us how you're going to record absences, please? Or can you show us what you're going to do if someone doesn't show up for work? Now we've kind of taken the approach to sort of address that at license stage, so we can include some of that information at the start. If you get that letter, it can be a bit stressful because they tend to only give you about 5 working days to respond. So that's just something to be aware of, and definitely make sure that you've thought about all of that before you hit submit on the license application. In theory, they can do remote or on-site inspections. Remote inspections became much more common during COVID, and I mean that's still kind of the trend at the moment. And also, inspections can be announced or unannounced. I mean, you tend to get some warning that you're going to be inspected. You'd only really get an unannounced inspection if the Home Office was pretty suspicious about your activities, and then it would be something a bit more like a raid, if you like. But generally, if they want to come and inspect you, you generally get some warning of it. And then if they do come and inspect you, they will interview your key personnel, so your people who are in charge of managing the license. They will want to see things like absence records. They will want to see files that you've got for employees, and they will want to know that your workers are doing the jobs for which they've been sponsored. If all that goes well, you pass your inspection, all good. If not, you can expect some sanctions. So worst case scenario, you can get your license revoked if you've already got it, or if this is a pre-license grant inspection. So if they're inspecting you before they've even granted your license, then you can get your application refused. A refusal can be pretty serious because you can't reapply for 12 months, and that's what's referred to as the cooling off period. And then you should expect any subsequent application to be subject to more scrutiny the next time round. If your license, if you're inspected during the life of your license and it's revoked, that means that all your sponsored employees sort of lose their right to be in the UK, essentially, which can obviously be very disruptive to your business, not to mention the disruption that causes to their lives. They normally get about 60 days to either sort out another sponsor or leave the UK. If they've got families here, it can be really disastrous for all concerned. So pretty serious. I mean, that is worst case scenario. And yeah, in terms of what's required, I touched on kind of proving your case before you apply for the license, which we find to be quite a good idea. Generally, it's things like having strong HR systems and perfect right to work checks. We've actually got another webinar, which I'll talk about shortly in a couple of months, which is specifically to do with this compliance stuff. So that will cover in a lot more detail than I've been able to today, the kind of duties that you need to comply with, how to get it right, what can go wrong, that sort of thing. So the date for that is coming up on a later slide. Okay, next one. Back to Louis, I think, for this one.
Thanks. So just touching on the chat, thanks Benson, who says you do not have a license. I don't know if anyone else does or if they're just being coy. And Dr. EJ asked the question, what happens to the staff visa? So I think that was in response to Michelle talking about so when you sponsor someone, you're not obliged to keep them just because you're sponsoring them. Okay, so sometimes we get asked, well, what if we sponsor someone, they turn out to be rubbish, we need to terminate, are we obliged to keep them? So the answer is, as Michelle said, is no. But what happens to their visa? So whenever you cease to sponsor someone, you have a duty to tell the Home Office. I think it's within 10 days. So if Joe Blogs is terminated, you'd have to tell the Home Office. When the Home Office get round to it, they will send what's called a curtailment letter. So it's a letter cutting short the individual's visa, and that's cut short to 60 days. They normally take a while to send out that letter, so it's obviously a problem for the individual. They're in a bit of a rush to try and find some other kind of immigration option. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so we've been focusing on the sponsorship side, so what the employer has to do. But the final, just going back to the kind of overall process, the final step is for the individual to get their visa. Okay, that's the end result. So I've said here 95% of the battle is about getting the certificate of sponsorship from you, the employer. However, there are some of these are obvious things, some of them less obvious things, that attributes or things that the individual has to have. So as sponsor, you're really responsible for selecting the person with appropriate experience, who's well suited to the role. Sorry. Now, you should be, I mean, you'll want to do this for your own sake anyway, but also from an immigration point of view, you need to be able to demonstrate why you've selected someone. Okay. They don't have to submit all this information with the visa application, but again, this is to be retained if and when you're inspected. So in practice, you would want to be ensuring you are obtaining references from a previous employer. It would be advisable to take notes of your interview, and you should certainly be keeping copies of CVs. And if the person says they have qualifications, you must keep a copy of those qualifications. But these are not documents to be sent with a visa application. These are to be retained on file. In terms of the actual visa application itself, the individual has to satisfy the English language requirement. And this is probably one of the first things you need to be thinking of when you're considering whether to sponsor someone. The required level is level B for Bravo 1. Okay. It's a fairly kind of intermediate level, but they do have to pass a test. So the normal way is to pass a test. So there's other ways that I'll come to. But most people have to pass a designated test in speaking, reading, writing, and listening at level B1 or above. And it must be from an approved test center. And it must be an approved test. So just be careful of that one, because you could sit a much higher level test, but if it's not the exact right one, the whole visa application will be refused. You could also satisfy the English language requirement if you're from a recognized majority English speaking country, but that does not include a lot of countries that you think it maybe should be. So like South Africa is not recognized as a majority English speaking country. Nigeria is not recognized. The list goes on. So if you're not from one of those countries, or if you have a degree taught in English, if that degree was taught in English in the UK, that's fine. All you need is your so Benson's just said if they have a degree taught in English, will they still? So yeah, just coming to that. So if the degree is taught in English in the UK, if they've done it at a UK university at degree level or above, they've satisfied that requirement. They just need to provide their certificate normally. If the degree is taught overseas at degree level or above, it has to be verified by an independent body called ECTIS. And they have to verify that A, it was degree level or above, and B, that it was taught in English. Or there's a few other ways. If someone's previously had a visa application accepted at the same level or above, then they can also meet the requirement that way. But what you've got to watch out for is, if someone seems, I guess, if they can't speak English to a reasonable level, they're not going to be able to do their job fundamentally. But sometimes passing the written component can be slightly challenging. So as part of your interview process, you want to be having half an eye at least on whether they're going to be able to pass that or satisfy the English language requirement. They only need to satisfy that requirement at the point at which they submit the visa application. So you don't need to be getting them to pass that test, right at the very beginning. You could do, or you could just have the confidence they will be able to pass. Right, criminal records check. So you'll normally need a criminal records check, which you can get. So this is the individual will get from their country they're residing in. And then a TB, a tuberculosis test. So only people from certain countries who residing in certain countries need a test, but most, for example, the likes of India, Africa, so most countries will require a TB test, and they're only valid for 6 months, those tests. But generally speaking, the actual visa process is pretty straightforward. Okay, it's really all about getting the sponsorship, 95%. Okay, thanks. Katie, next, please. Okay, so we're getting near to the end now. Do I need a lawyer? So the answer is not necessarily. Okay. It's a kind of strange one, the sponsor license system, in that it's kind of half set up so you can do it yourself, but it's very user unfriendly. Okay. So as Michelle highlighted earlier on, the Home Office expect you to be familiar with their guidance, which has over 300 pages to get on top of. Now, a lot of that will not be directly relevant, but there are various guides that you are supposed to be familiar with. What I would generally say as a rule of thumb is that if you have time on your hands, quite a significant amount of time, and you have a good attention to detail, then you can consider doing this yourself. But just bear in mind also, it's not just a case of getting the license. So you can't, in some ways, you can kind of get the license perhaps without too much difficulty once you get your head around the various guides. But you also need to understand how sponsor license compliance works. So you need to kind of understand the bigger picture, because if you just get the license but you're not doing stuff correctly, at some point the Home Office say they intend to inspect everyone. So you get a letter in 3 years' time saying we're going to turn up in 2 weeks' time. Now, if you've just not been doing stuff correctly, there's a significant risk that you could have your license revoked, which is what Michelle was talking about earlier, with significant challenges. So it's not just about getting the license. You do need to genuinely engage with this whole process and the requirements of sponsorship. If you do want to apply on your own, we have an 8,000 word legal guide on how to do it, and it's genuinely a lot of law firms will sort of give you a bit of information, tantalize you, and then say contact us and we'll tell you more. We actually tell you exactly what you have to do in these guides, so it's genuinely giving away the sort of inside secrets. If you want to do it on your own, then do have a look at that specific guide. It gets a lot of hits, so we know that a lot of people are using that to get their licenses. Benson has asked, can a recruitment agency apply for a sponsorship license? So the answer to that is probably not for the reasons that you want it. So a recruitment agency can't have a license and then farm individuals out to a third party. That's not permitted, I'm afraid. The only time that a recruitment agency could have a license would be to sponsor individuals involved with the core running of the business. Okay, so Benson, if you wanted a marketing manager, or you wanted a CEO, or you wanted a web developer, so involved in the core running of your business, you can have a license and you can sponsor people to work in that capacity. Unfortunately, what you can't do is to sponsor individuals as employees and then have them contracted out to third parties. And the reason for that, because is all to do with the sponsor license compliance. So the Home Office don't believe that you would have genuine control over the individuals. So I'm afraid that's So you can't contract out in that way. Okay. So why might you want a lawyer? And really, it's oh, thank you, Benson. Why might you want a lawyer? Well, it's really the reverse of what I've already said. So you will save a considerable amount of time and stress. So people who do it on their own are often left in a kind of state of utter bemusement about why this process is so needlessly complicated. Like I say, it's not obvious what to do. If you get the application wrong, unfortunately, not only do you get refused or can you get refused, but you're also banned from reapplying for a certain period of time, anything from 6 months to 2 years. So obviously the idea would be that if you were to use a lawyer, especially ourselves, that we'd be getting it right. And again, as I said, if you don't, you can get a license without, I mean, it could get refused, but if you get a license, you don't really know what you're doing, you can create problems in the longer term with stuff like compliance inspections. So certainly we focus not just on kind of how to get the license, how to get them over the line, but how to, without wanting to sound patronizing, how to educate you about everything to do with sponsorship. Next slide, please. Okay, just a little bit of, this is, I think, the second last slide. So just a little bit about what we've been doing in the care sector. So a couple of years back, we, amongst many others, recognized that it was a real injustice that normal care workers, so not senior care workers, weren't capable of sponsorship and they weren't on the shortage occupation list. So myself, in conjunction with the Immigration Law Practitioners Association, we pushed for the inclusion of care workers in the shortage occupation list, and thankfully that came through in February this year. Separately, we've lobbied for the abolition of this hideous resident labour market test. Horrible thing, you had to advertise, it was kind of British jobs for British people, advertised for 28 days before you could sponsor abroad. That's been abolished. As I mentioned at the start, we've really focused, I'd say the majority of our work is helping care sector businesses. So we've helped at least 20 care providers to get the license, and many more with sort of ad hoc bits of work around sponsoring individuals or helping the individuals they're sponsoring with their visa applications. We're fresh back, well, Michelle and Katie are fresh back from UK Care Week, so had a great time there meeting other people in the sector. So it's partly, we thought we'd try and get this on quite soon afterwards while it's still fresh in people's minds. As I mentioned before, we have extensive guides telling you what to do. So we're very happy for you to come to us and obviously instruct us and pay us, but we're equally happy for you to look at our guides and try and figure out how to do it yourself. And we are also, we're official suppliers to the National Care Association. Okay, Benson's just got another question. How long does a business have to be in operation before they can apply for a sponsorship license? That's a good question. And he says, is it 2 years or more? So the question is, how long do you have to be operating or trading for before you can get a license? There's no black and white answer to that, and there's no set time. As an absolute minimum, you have to be registered with the Companies House, and you have to be able to provide certain core documents, such as bank statements are mandatory, and various other things. It's consider it as a sliding scale. The longer you've been trading, the more likely you are to succeed. but I'm actually just now advising a company who's not yet trading. They've registered, I happened to register quite a few years ago, but aren't doing business. In that situation, it's more complicated. They've got a parent company that is trading. So you need kind of evidence that there's money somewhere. Okay, so the answer is there's no black and white rule. Preferably if you can provide a year's accounts. So after your financial year is finished, you've got a set of accounts. That's going to put you in a stronger position, but you can do it earlier, but you'll need to provide evidence of funding, possibly a business plan. It gets a bit more complicated. But there's definitely no 2-year rule. That doesn't exist. Okay. Next slide, please. So I think this is really finishing up now. So a bit of shameless self-promotion. Why Truth Legal? So we have a dedicated immigration team. That's all we do. We are genuine immigration experts. And like I said, we do have a particular interest in the care sector. So I think we're one of the few firms who are genuine immigration experts and have a particular interest in the care sector. We offer a free no obligation initial consultation and assessment. So basically, if you want to go down this road, get in touch. We'll have a free 20-minute discussion with you about what's required, whether you're likely to get sponsorship, and kind of along the lines of what we're talking about today, what you need to be aware of. And then we'll give you a quote, and then you basically won't hear from us again. We're not going to be harassing you. We'll leave it with you. In terms of our fees, we offer a staged approach. So it is mandatory to have a detailed consultation. So you have a free consultation, but it is mandatory to have a detailed consultation where it'll be up to an hour, going through everything in detailed advice. But then beyond that, we'll call it a la carte. You can choose what services you want. The obvious one is for us to help you get a license, but we can also help you to apply for a certificate of sponsorship, to assign a certificate of sponsorship. We can help you to prepare a compliance report or prepare for a home office inspection. So all this kind of different stuff. We'll all do it in stages. And we like to think that we are friendly and approachable and have a high standard. I don't know if you can read that, but we have pretty exceptional reviews on Trustpilot and Review Solicitor. So if in doubt, have a look at that and you can see what other people are saying about us. Next slide, please. Okay, we had 2 more. Just so some future webinar. This is actually the first in a series of webinars, and they are all about sort of employment and immigration. So today's been specifically on care workers, but we have some very interesting webinars coming up from our employment team, which are of complete relevance if you're in the care sector, but also of high relevance just generally. So the next one we've got is Employment Law Basics, 5 essential documents you need. So we're looking at stuff like written particulars and employment contracts, privacy and GDPR, equal ops, workplace grievances, disciplinary rules and procedures. That's on the 5th of August. And then you'll see on the 6th of September, we've got a dedicated session on sponsor license compliance and how to stay on the right side of the Home Office. If you're going to get into sponsorship, I would strongly recommend you attend that. We're actually going to be inviting all of our existing clients to go on that as a sort of refresher for what they're meant to be doing. And then we've got the employment lifestyle, recruitment to termination and beyond, which again is a focus from our employment team. So we'll be promoting those, but please do sign up for those. We'll have details on our website, and I guess we'll be sending out a reminder email to you on those topics. Next slide. And I think that's really everything that we had to say. So we've left mine and Michelle's contact details. mobiles are there, and obviously our email address, inquiries at Truth Legal or immigration at Truth Legal, will get through to us. So does anyone have any, I mean, there's been a few questions that have gone along, but has anyone got any questions before we call it a day and I'll try and cool down? Cool. Okay. Well, that's we'll wrap it up there. Unless I think we've covered everything, Michelle, haven't we?
Yep, nothing to add.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining. It's been really great to have you, and we hope to see you again at some of these future webinars. And yeah, have a great day. Stay cool.